I'm 66 years old now, and the truth has been gnawing at me like frost on bone. They say the past fades, that time wears memory down to dull edges, but not this one. This one still breathes in the back of my mind, still wakes me on winter nights when the wind claws at the roof. It began in the winter of '78, a season so cruel it felt like the world wanted to start over and bury the living with the dead. The snow came early that year, thick, unrelenting, swallowing trails and men alike. My only company was my old hound, Briscoe, a loyal beast with a limp in his left leg and a soul too gentle for the hunts I dragged him on. We lived alone up near the Bitterroot timberline, where the trees grew so close you could hear them whisper when the cold set in. That winter took everything from the valley. Deer vanished, the river froze solid, and even the pines seemed to stop breathing. I cut wood, trapped hair, spoke only to the fire. There's a kind of silence out there that doesn't just sit around you, it seeps in, starts talking back. Some nights, when the wind slid through the eaves, I swore I heard voices calling from the dark. Maybe that's what loneliness does. It teaches you to listen for things that shouldn't exist. It was on one of those gray mornings, when the air burned the lungs and Briscoe's paws left shallow prints in the frost, that I found the blood. Not much, just a trail, thick, dark, half-frozen at the edges, leading off into the timber where the birches leaned east like broken soldiers. The pattern was wrong. Too far apart for a man, too heavy for an elk. I followed it out of habit, not courage. Habit keeps a woodsman alive longer than sense does. Briscoe stayed close, his ears pinned, tail low. The smell of iron hung in the air, sharp enough to taste. Half a mile up the ridge I saw it. A shape slumped beside the frozen creek, half buried in wind-blown snow. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't bleed red like that and they sure as hell don't groan. It was alive. I stepped closer, axe ready, heart pounding. The thing's chest rose once, slow and ragged. When the snow cleared from its face, I saw eyes staring back. Human in shape, but deeper somehow, like looking into the dark side of the moon. One was swollen shut, the other watched me with something that wasn't fear, wasn't rage. It was sorrow. That was what made me freeze. I should have run. Every instinct told me this was wrong. But it was dying and I knew what that felt like. I'd watched my wife slip away years earlier, breath by breath, and I couldn't do it again, not even to a creature I didn't understand. So I dropped the axe, muttered a curse under my breath and went to my knees in the snow. The wound was bad. A deep tear through the thigh, blackened around the edges. Not a trap wound. A bullet. And not the kind you find in hunting shops. Briscoe barked, pacing in circles, his fur on end. "Easy, boy," I whispered, though my voice trembled too. It took every ounce of strength and stubbornness I had to drag that creature home. I lashed it to my sled, covered it with old canvas, and pulled until my lungs burned raw. The snow came heavier, thick flakes clinging to my beard, and by the time we reached the cabin I could barely feel my hands. Inside I cleared the table, lit the fire, and worked by lamplight. The smell of blood and smoke filled the room, mingling with the scent of pine pitch and whiskey. I heated the blade till it glowed, cleaned the wound as best I could while it twitched and groaned, its huge fingers curling against the boards. The sound it made when the iron touched flesh wasn't animal, it was heartbreak turned to voice. When it finally went still I thought it had died. But as dawn bled gray across the snow, I saw its chest rise again. I sat there till morning, listening to its breath rattle and Briscoe's tail thump softly against the floor. I should have been terrified, but exhaustion numbs fear. Instead, I felt something stranger, responsibility. The kind you don't choose but can't turn away from. Over the next few days the fever came and went. I fed it broth, wrapped its leg in clean bandages, changed them when the blood seeped through. Its body was covered in old scars, thick like rope beneath the fur. It had been hunted long before I found it. Once, while wiping its forehead, I noticed it watching me, not with gratitude but confusion, as if it couldn't understand why I hadn't left it in the snow. Maybe I couldn't either. The days blurred. Outside, storms rolled down from the peaks, burying the world deeper. Inside, time moved like smoke. I spoke aloud just to hear something human. Told stories about my wife, about the cabin I built with my own hands, about the way the valley used to smell before the logging companies came. Sometimes I thought it listened. Other times I thought I was going mad. On the fourth night, as I was dozing by the fire, I heard movement. It was standing, shaky, tall enough that its head nearly brushed the rafters. The firelight caught its eyes again, soft and sad. I froze, my pulse slamming in my neck. But it didn't attack. It just looked at me, then pointed toward the door, toward the woods beyond. I thought it meant to leave. But when I unlatched the door, the cold hit us both like knives. The snow had piled waist deep, the night sky a sheet of pale silver. The creature shuddered once, then stepped back inside. It sat near the fire, curling its long fingers around the warmth. I swear I saw it sigh. That was the first night I believed it wanted to live. I named it Ashfoot, though I didn't say it aloud. The name came from the burns on its leg and the way its steps left smudges of gray in the snow, as if it carried the ashes of another life. Briscoe eventually stopped growling. The three of us fell into a rhythm of sorts, me chopping wood, Briscoe sleeping near the door, and the creature sitting quiet by the hearth, mending its own bandages with uncanny care. Once I caught it watching me split logs, then later it picked up the axe and mimicked the motion, not perfect but close. That was the moment I stopped calling it in my head. One afternoon I found something in the wound I'd missed before, a small piece of brass wedged near the bone. I pried it free and wiped the blood away. It was a bullet casing. Military issue. Government mark stamped clean into the metal. My gut turned cold. Out here hunters used hand-loaded rounds. This meant someone official had been after him. Someone with reason and orders. I dropped the casing into the fire, watched it hiss and curl black. That night I hardly slept. I kept thinking about those eyes, about the way Ashfoot flinched at the sound of helicopters that sometimes passed high above the valley. There was more to his fear than instinct. It was memory. Something had been done to him. Something human. I looked at him lying there in the dim firelight, breathing slow, his chest rising like the tide. And for the first time since the day I found him, I realized he wasn't just surviving. He was hiding. When morning came, the forest was silent again, wrapped in a thin veil of fog. Briscoe barked once at nothing, then settled near the door. I sat by the window, turning the burned bullet between my fingers, feeling the weight of it like a secret. Outside, the snow began to fall in soft, steady flakes, erasing our tracks one by one. I didn't know it then, but that was the morning the world started watching us backed up by the time the thaw came. The world around my cabin had changed its face. The snow melted slow, pulling the forest back from its long sleep. The pines dripped with water that caught the sun like glass, and the creeks woke up snarling, tearing through the banks with a kind of vengeance. I was 51 that spring and I felt every year of it in my bones. But Ashfoot, he was something older than years. The firelight had become his language and silence was mine. Sometimes he'd sit for hours, carving strange lines into bark with a piece of bone, humming so low it felt more like the earth breathing through him. I didn't understand it, not the patterns or the sounds, but I didn't need to. The air between us had learned to speak. Briscoe warmed to him first. Maybe animals sense the truth quicker than we do. I'd wake to find the hound's grizzled head resting against Ashfoot's leg, their breath mingling in sleep like they'd been kin all along. That sight softened something in me I didn't know was still alive. In the evenings, I'd pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit and set one by the hearth. Ashfoot would only smell it, never drink, but I liked the ritual. It made the silence feel shared instead of empty. One morning, while fixing a trapline near the ridge, I came back to find my axe gone. Panic hit before reason did. My hand went for the rifle. But then I saw him outside, standing over a fallen birch, my axe swinging in those long arms like it was made of air. The first strike was clumsy. The second clean. When the trunk split, he looked toward me, waiting for some kind of approval. I nodded once, throat tight. He gave a sound, half sigh, half growl, that almost felt like laughter. For a moment I forgot what he was. Or maybe I remembered what he wasn't. That spring taught me something the wars never did. Survival is quiet work. We rebuilt the cabin roof, hunted enough to fill the smokehouse, stacked wood till the pile reached the window. He learned by watching. I learned by listening. Once I caught him kneeling by the creek, washing his burned leg with cupped hands, and for the first time I saw the scars up close. Circular marks, faded but deliberate, as though iron had kissed his flesh more than once. The shape was too perfect to be accident. Branding, maybe. The thought made my stomach twist. I turned away, ashamed, not of him but of whatever man had done that. The nights grew shorter, filled with thunder that rolled down the mountains like drums of some far-off army. He hated the storms. Each flash of lightning sent him crouching low, eyes wide, breath trembling. I talked to him softly, nonsense words mostly, until it passed. When the sky cleared, he'd sit by the window and stare out like a man remembering fire. Sometimes I wondered if he had a name for me too, one he whispered into the trees when I wasn't listening. Weeks passed. My hair grew grayer, his fur darker with the rain. I spoke more, he mimicked more. Once I taught him how to whittle by handing him a stick and blade. His hands were too large, too careful, and yet he shaped that wood into something almost human, a small figure, crude but gentle. He placed it on the mantel beside my wife's photograph. I couldn't bring myself to move it. It stayed there between memory and miracle, watching over us. But peace never holds in these woods for long. The first sign came from town. I rode down for supplies, and the storekeeper, a jittery man named Conrad, told me about new faces in the area. Men in gray trucks, carrying radios, camping near the ridge. Said they were government surveyors, though they asked too many questions about hunting routes and missing dogs. I kept my face still, bought my flour and kerosene, and left before my hands started shaking. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than ever. Every turn of the wheel whispered that something was closing in. When I reached the cabin, Ashfoot was gone. The door stood open, wind scattering ash across the floor. Briscoe barked once and ran toward the trees. I followed, heart clawing its way up my chest. Half a mile in, I found him standing in the clearing, staring at the sky. A helicopter moved above the valley, its blades beating slow like a monstrous heart. He froze, not in wonder but in pure terror. His breath came in sharp, broken bursts. I'd seen that kind of fear before, in soldiers when the shelling began. Not fear of death but memory of it. I stepped forward, put a hand on his arm. His muscles quivered like a frightened horse. When the machine finally passed, he sank to his knees and pressed his forehead to the ground, as if begging the earth to take him back. That night he wouldn't eat. Just sat in the corner, eyes flicking toward the window. I wanted to tell him he was safe, but the lie caught in my throat. I'd seen the casing in his leg, seen the brand. The men in the trucks weren't looking for what they didn't believe in, they were looking for what they'd lost control of. I sat awake until dawn, turning the thought over like a blade in my palm. Every sound outside felt like the end coming closer. The next morning, while cutting wood, I noticed movement behind me. Ashfoot was crouched near the fire pit, tracing shapes into the dirt. 3 lines crossing a circle. Over and over, patient, deliberate. I didn't recognize it then. Later I'd learn it matched the warning symbol used in quarantine zones, classified operations, viral containment, experimental fields. I remember his eyes when he looked up, pleading without words. I understood enough. Whatever had made him fear humans wasn't nature. It was us. The days after that bled into each other. The men in trucks combed the lower trails. I caught the echo of their radios at dusk, the smell of diesel drifting up through the pines. Ashfoot stayed close, moving only at night. Once I caught him watching me pack my rifle. He pointed at it, then at himself, shaking his head. No guns. I nodded, ashamed again. Maybe that's what trust costs, a surrender of what once kept you alive. When summer came, I saw how the light softened his features. The forest turned green again, and for a while we almost looked like a family. I'd fish the creek, he'd carry the logs, Briscoe chasing between us like a pup reborn. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in his eyes and not recognize myself. The loneliness that had gnawed at me for years had gone quiet. I should have known peace that deep was borrowed time. One evening, near sunset, I heard voices through the trees, men laughing, metal clinking. I froze. Ashfoot stiffened, his ears twitching toward the sound. Without a word, he grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. We doused the fire, covered the windows. The laughter grew closer, then faded. But the air didn't ease. Something had shifted. We sat there in the dark for hours, breathing slow, listening to the forest hold its breath. When I finally dared to speak, he turned to me and drew that same symbol again in the ash, slower this time. Then he looked up, eyes glistening, and pressed his palm against my chest. A promise or a warning, I couldn't tell which. That night, I dreamed of my wife standing in the doorway, whispering something I couldn't hear over the wind. When I woke, the fire was dead and Ashfoot was gone. Panic flared. I stumbled into the clearing, calling his name though he'd never known it. The forest answered only with rain. Hours passed before I saw him returning from the ridge, carrying a sack of meat soaked to the bone. He dropped it by the door and looked at me, exhausted but calm. For the first time I realized he'd gone not to run, but to protect. He'd led them away. We didn't speak of it, not that we could. But something between us shifted after that. I stopped thinking of him as something I'd found. I started thinking of him as someone I'd been sent. We were both fugitives of our own kind, me from grief, him from whatever hell men had built in the dark. The next morning, the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I stepped outside, feeling the weight of the air, and saw the faint imprint of boot tracks leading toward the creek. The mud still glistened. I followed them halfway before they vanished in water, but the fear didn't. When I returned, Ashfoot was sitting by the window, watching the pines sway like they were whispering secrets to him. I sat across from him, the silence thick as snow. He met my eyes once, then turned to the glass and exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. Somewhere deep in that sound was the truth I'd been avoiding. He wasn't just hiding from men, he was waiting for the day they'd come. And when they did, he'd face them alone. I didn't know it then, but the world beyond those trees had already started listening for him again. The years don't move the same way in the mountains. They don't pass, they settle, like dust in the corners of your memory, quiet and thick until one day you realize how much weight they've gathered. After that summer, the world around me slowed to a hush. The government trucks stopped coming. The tracks faded and the snow took back what was left. But inside that silence, something else was changing. Ashfoot grew wary of the open sky. He lingered near the cabin more, his eyes sharper, haunted. Briscoe was gone by then, buried beneath the pines with a carved wooden marker Ashfoot made himself. I still remember the way he placed his hand on the grave, palm flat against the dirt, and how the wind seemed to bow through the trees as if paying its own respects. From that day on, he followed me closer than a shadow. In the winter of 1981, my body began to betray me. The years of cold and solitude had worn through bone and breath alike. My hands trembled when I chopped wood. I coughed blood into rags and burned them before dawn. Ashfoot watched everything, always from a few steps away, as if studying sickness like it was another language he needed to learn. He started bringing me things, herbs, pine resin, roots I didn't recognize. Once he left a bowl of melted snow water mixed with crushed bark on my table. I pretended to drink it, but later when I did, the pain eased. Whatever he knew wasn't from men. It was older. We lived in a rhythm, the two of us, part caretaker, part secret keepers. I kept to my promise without ever saying it aloud. No one knew he existed. The few townsfolk who remembered me assumed the woods had taken me too. I didn't correct them. I spent my days repairing traps I no longer used, carving bits of wood into shapes I couldn't name. Sometimes, when the wind howled down from the ridges, he'd sit across from me and hum that low, wordless tune again. It vibrated through the walls, through my chest. It felt like prayer. But peace never stays long in this world, not for creatures like us. In the summer of '84, a lightning storm rolled through the valley unlike anything I'd seen before. It hit dry ground and turned the mountainside into a wall of fire. I woke to the smell of smoke, choking thick, clawing through the cracks. Ashfoot was already moving, throwing buckets of water against the walls, pushing me toward the door. Outside, the trees glowed red, sparks leaping like ghosts. I stumbled through the heat, coughing, my vision swimming. When the roof gave way, I saw him reach for me, his burned arm pulling me through the flames. The fire roared behind us, swallowing 40 years of my life in one breath. He carried me down to the creek, laid me in the shallows, and poured water over my face until I could breathe again. His fur was blackened, the skin beneath blistered and raw. He didn't make a sound, not even when the pain tore through him. I tried to get up, but the smoke had stripped the strength from my lungs. He stayed by my side till morning, sitting in the ash and rain, the world around us hissing and steaming like a wound trying to heal. When I opened my eyes again, the cabin was gone. All that remained was the chimney and a few twisted nails glinting in the soot. 4 days we lived by the creek, drinking from cupped hands, eating what little we could find. His burns healed slower than before. He avoided the sunlight, moving only at dusk. I think he knew the end was close, not his but mine. Each night he'd touch my shoulder as if counting my breaths. There's a kind of love that doesn't need words. It lives in small acts, like the way he'd drag a blanket over me when I shook from fever or place his own food by my side before eating. That's how I remember him, not as some myth or monster, but as a being who learned gentleness in a world that gave him none. Then one morning I woke to silence. He was gone. His footprints led north into the charred remains of the forest. I called his name, if you can call a wordless sound a name, but there was no answer, only the distant cry of crows. The truth settled over me then. He'd left to draw them away again, the men who always returned after fire. I waited 3 days before the trucks came. They combed the hills, rifles slung, their uniforms stained with smoke. One of them stopped by the ruins of my cabin, asking questions about strange sightings, about tracks too large to be bears. I told them nothing. The younger ones didn't believe me, the older ones looked like they already knew. When they left, I found one of their maps half buried in the mud. Marked circles. Red ink. One of them sat right over my land. I burned it that night. The years after that blurred into quiet decay. My hair turned white, my voice rough as bark. Sometimes I'd catch sight of something tall moving between the trees at dusk, and my heart would tighten until I could hardly breathe. I'd tell myself it was memory, nothing more, but deep down I knew better. He was still out there, watching, keeping the promise neither of us had ever spoken. The seasons rolled on. The forest healed. I rebuilt what I could, though I never stayed long in one place. There were stories that began to spread again. hunters whispering about lights in the pines, about strange calls echoing through the canyons. I listened and I waited and I never told them they were right. By the time I reached my 60s, the world had changed too much to recognize. Towns grew, roads carved through the ridges, and the government sold what they once guarded. But up there in those mountains the air still tasted of wood smoke and pine. I moved back in the spring of 2023, old bones, same valley. I built a smaller cabin, quieter, with my hands slower but steadier than I expected. Sometimes, when the moon hung low and the mist crawled through the trees, I'd hear the same low hum that had once filled my home. The same rhythm, the same ache. And in those moments I could almost believe he was near. I keep a recorder on my table now. My voice doesn't carry like it used to, but it's enough. I speak into it every night, telling the story no one asked for, the story I've spent 45 years pretending never happened. I do it because secrets rot when you bury them too deep. And maybe when I'm gone, someone will hear this and understand that the world isn't as simple as we pretend. I saved something once and it saved me back. That's all anyone needs to know. There are days when I see the edge of the forest move, just a shadow between trunks, then stillness again. The rational part of me says it's the wind. But the heart knows better. The heart remembers how silence feels when it's listening. I've come to believe that he never left completely. That he became the forest, its watcher, its ghost, its breath in the cold. Sometimes I talk to him out loud, thank him for carrying me out of the fire, for teaching me that mercy doesn't need words. I never hear a reply, but I always feel the air shift as if something vast had exhaled. I won't last much longer. The coughs come back heavier this time. My hands shake so bad I can hardly load the stove. But I'm not afraid. I've lived more years than I deserve. And I know now that the things we save, whether man or beast, save pieces of us in return. There's a peace in that. Still, I wonder sometimes what became of him, if he found others, if he remembers my voice. The world will never know what I saw, and maybe that's for the best. Truth like this doesn't fit in men's mouths, it breaks them. Tonight the wind's picking up again, same sound as that night long ago. The pine needles rattle against the glass and the air smells of snow. I close my eyes and listen. There it is, the hum. Low, distant, steady. I can almost hear my name in it. Or maybe it's just the earth breathing him back to me one last time. I press the record button and whisper the words I've been holding for half a lifetime. If you're still out there, my friend, thank you. For showing me the kind of kindness no man ever did. The light on the recorder blinks once, then steadies. The fire crackles low. Outside, something moves beyond the tree line, tall, slow, patient. The snow begins to fall, soft and soundless, covering the ground where his prints used to be. And for the first time since that winter in '78, I feel warm again. I think that's how secrets end, not with silence, but with a breath shared between what's remembered and what's gone. The world doesn't need to believe me. It just needs to keep listening. Because out there, somewhere in the dark, I swear I hear him still, walking through the pines, carrying the truth neither of us could bury.